The frozen bear asked the little girl to enter the house. What happens next is unbelievable before we get into the story. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The blizzard howled outside, its ferocious winds tearing through the sky, battering the old wooden cabin as if determined to rip it apart. Inside, the flickering fire in the hearth cast dancing shadows on the walls, its warmth barely holding back the creeping chill. Elara Dawson, a 10-year-old girl, sat curled up in a worn wool blanket, her gaze fixed on the frosted window. Beyond it, the world was nothing but an endless stretch of white, swallowed in the fury of winter. Her grandfather, Jonah Dawson, sat in his rocking chair, his calloused fingers slowly flipping through the pages of an old book. At 70, Jonah had weathered more storms than anyone in their small town, and he knew when to trust his instincts. Then came the scratching at the door. Elara stiffened. At first, she thought it was a branch broken by the wind, scraping against the wood. But then it came again, slow, deliberate, weak, and then a low, pained growl. Jonah's book lowered, his sharp eyes narrowing. "No one should be out in this weather," he muttered, reaching for the old hunting rifle mounted on the wall. Elara hesitated but stepped toward the door, her small hand trembling as she reached for the handle. Something deep in her gut told her this was no human. A deep, rumbling sound followed, not threatening but pleading. Summoning her courage, Elara unlatched the door. A massive shadow collapsed onto the porch. The frozen bear, her breath hitched. Lying before her was a massive grizzly bear, its body trembling violently from the cold. Its fur was crusted with ice, its breath labored, and its wild eyes held something she had never seen in an animal before: desperation, and something that almost looked like trust. Elara instinctively took a step back. Jonah was right behind her, rifle raised, but he didn't fire. "Never seen a bear come to humans like this before," he murmured, lowering the barrel slightly. The bear let out a weak whimper, its colossal frame collapsing completely. A deep gash ran along its side, blood turning black in the freezing air. This wasn't a simple injury from the wild. It had been shot. Elara swallowed hard. She didn't need to be an expert to know one thing. If they didn't help, this bear was going to die. A dangerous decision. "We have to do something," Elara pleaded, turning to Jonah. Her grandfather stared long and hard at the wounded creature. Years of experience had taught him to respect the balance of nature. But this was different. Jonah exhaled through his nose. "I'm gonna regret this," he muttered, and pushed the door open wider. The bear didn't hesitate. It staggered inside, its sheer size filling half the cabin as it collapsed near the fire, its breath coming in ragged gasps. The mark of the beast under the firelight. Something caught Elara's attention. A scar on the bear's shoulder, unlike any she had ever seen. It wasn't natural. It was a brand, a circular emblem, with a string of numbers burned deep into its flesh. Jonah stiffened the moment he saw it. His face paled. "Elara." His voice was barely above a whisper. "You know what it is?" she asked. He nodded grimly. "This ain't just any bear. This mark, it's from Project Borealis." The hunters in the snow before Elara could ask. A sound outside made them both freeze. This time it wasn't the wind. It was footsteps. Slow, methodical, human. Jonah quickly snuffed out the lantern, motioning for Elara to stay quiet. They peered through the small frosted window. 3 figures in military-style coats moved through the snow, flashlights cutting through the darkness. One of them raised a radio to his mouth. "We've got a signal. The target is here." Elara's stomach dropped. They weren't lost travelers looking for shelter. They were hunting the bear. "The escape begins. We need to leave now," Jonah whispered. He grabbed his old pack, stuffing it with food and ammunition before motioning Elara toward the back door. "Hold this," He handed her a length of rope. The bear didn't resist as Ilara looped it loosely around its neck, as if it understood they were trying to save it. The three of them slipped into the storm, leaving behind the flickering glow of the cabin and the shadows of the men searching for them. The truth unveiled, they ran until they reached an old rocky overhang, half buried in snow. It was an old hideout Jonah had used decades ago while trapping in the mountains. Only once they were deep inside did he finally speak. "Who are those men?" Ilara asked, still panting from the cold. Jonah clenched his fists. "Government operatives, scientists, monsters." Ilara frowned. "What do you mean?" Her grandfather sighed. "They've been running experiments on wild animals, injecting them with things that don't belong in nature. And when those experiments fail, they erase the evidence." She turned to the bear. Its eyes were locked onto hers, not with the vacant, untamed stare of an animal, but with something far deeper. Something unnatural. It wasn't just a bear, it was a victim. A final choice the blizzard had begun to ease. But in the distance, the faint hum of approaching engines signaled their pursuers weren't far behind. Jonah met Ilara's gaze, his voice gray. "Kiddo, if this bear wants to live, it has to leave. Far away. Somewhere they'll never find it." Ilara hesitated, her hands shaking as she reached for the rope. Slowly, she untied it. The bear stood, its massive body moving with newfound strength. It looked at Ilara, long and deep, before letting out a low, rumbling growl. Not of anger, but something almost grateful. Then, without another sound, it turned and vanished into the snow. Ilara wiped at her eyes. "Will we ever see it again?" Jonah squeezed her shoulder gently. "If fate wills it, kiddo, it'll find its way back." Outside, the storm had passed, but inside them, a story had begun. One that neither of them would ever forget. A silent hunt in the snow, the howling wind had finally settled, leaving behind a deadly stillness. Snowflakes drifted lazily in the cold night air, falling upon the footprints that led away from Jonah Dawson's cabin. One set belonging to a girl, one to an old man, and the last belonging to something far larger. Ilara Dawson kept her head low, her breath visible in the freezing air as she followed her grandfather through the dense forest. Behind them, the bear moved like a shadow, its enormous form barely making a sound as it padded through the deep snow. Jonah walked with the steady certainty of a man who had spent a lifetime in these woods. His rifle was slung across his back, but the way his fingers rested near the strap told Ilara he was ready to use it at a moment's notice. Somewhere behind them, beyond the trees and hidden by the thick snowfall, the men who had been hunting the bear were still out there. "We need to move faster," Jonah muttered under his breath, eyes flicking toward the sky. "The storm's clearing, which means visibility's getting better. That ain't good for us." Ilara glanced at the bear, which still followed them without hesitation. The deep gash in its side had stopped bleeding, but its heavy breaths told her it was still in pain. Yet it refused to leave them. She didn't know if it was instinct, gratitude, or something more. But she knew one thing. This bear wasn't just running. It was fighting for something. And so were they. The footsteps that shouldn't be there, Jonah, led them to a ridge overlooking a frozen river, the landscape stretching for miles in every direction. "If we can make it to the caves up ahead," Jonah said, pointing to a jagged cluster of rock formations, "we'll have cover. Those men won't be able to track us easy through there." Ilara nodded, ready to move. But then she heard it crunch. A single footstep in the snow. Not from Jonah, not from her. Her stomach turned ice cold. Someone was nearby. She didn't dare turn her head, but she felt the shift in the bear's stance beside her. It had heard it too, and it wasn't afraid. It was ready. Jonah slowly reached for his rifle. His voice was barely more than a breath. "We're not alone." The hunters close in before they could react. A red light flickered through the trees. A laser sight. A gun was aimed at them. "Elara, get down!" Jonah snapped, shoving her behind a snow-covered boulder. The bear let out a guttural growl, the sound deep and feral. A shot rang out. The bullet struck the rock just inches from Elara's head, sending splinters of ice and stone flying. Jonah raised his rifle, firing back into the trees. The darkness erupted with return fire. They were surrounded. "Elara, listen to me," Jonah said, his voice eerily calm despite the chaos. "I need you to take the bear and get to the caves. I'll hold them off." "No." Elara's heart pounded. "I'm not leaving you. You have to, girl," Jonah roared. "This ain't about me. This is about keeping that bear out of their hands. They want it back, and we ain't gonna let that happen." Another shot rang out. Jonah cursed as he ducked for cover, reloading his weapon. Elara turned to the bear, whose massive frame blocked her from view of the gunman. Its golden-brown eyes locked onto hers, and she understood, without words, that it was waiting for her command. It was willing to follow her into the unknown. She clenched her fists. She couldn't leave Jonah behind, but she knew, if she hesitated any longer, they would all die. So she did the only thing she could. She grabbed the bear's thick fur, whispered, "Run!" and took off into the night. The chase through the ice they ran. Elara barely felt the ground beneath her as she pushed forward, the bear right beside her. The wind burned her lungs, the cold biting deep, but she didn't stop. Shots rang out behind them, voices shouting orders. "Move in, don't lose them!" Elara didn't dare look back. She couldn't. Ahead, the frozen river stretched before them, a vast sheet of ice leading straight to the caves Jonah had mentioned. But as she neared the edge, a sickening sound echoed beneath her feet. A crack. Elara's heart slammed against her ribs. The ice was breaking. She skidded to a halt, her boots sliding dangerously close to a fissure snaking across the surface. The bear stopped beside her, ears flicking back as it sensed the danger. Behind them, the hunters were closing in. She had seconds to decide. And then the bear moved. With a powerful shove, it knocked Elara off her feet, just as the ice gave way beneath it. The frozen river swallowed the beast whole. The depths below, no. Elara scrambled to the edge, her fingers digging into the ice. Below, the bear disappeared beneath the black water, its massive form sinking fast. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a desperate paw broke the surface. It was drowning. Elara didn't think. She acted. Ignoring the screaming cold, she threw herself onto the ice, reaching out. "Come on!" she cried, gripping onto the bear's thick fur as tightly as she could. The bear kicked, fought, struggled, but the current was pulling it under. Elara's muscles screamed as she pulled, but the weight was too much. She was losing it. And then a gunshot rang out, not at them, at the hunters. Jonah's last stand through the chaos. Elara saw Jonah standing atop the ridge, rifle raised, picking off their pursuers one by one. "You think you can take my family?" he roared. "Come and try, you bastards." More gunfire erupted, but Jonah held his ground. And that was the only distraction Elara needed. With one final desperate pull, she yanked the bear out of the river. The beast collapsed onto the ice, shuddering violently. But it was alive, and so was she. The final escape, go. Jonah's voice cut through the night. "Get to the caves. I'll meet you there." Elara hesitated. But then the bear nudged her forward. It was telling her the same thing. So she ran. Through the snow, through the darkness, she and the bear moved as one, escaping into the twisting labyrinth of caves that would finally hide them from the men who had hunted them for so long. Behind her, gunfire echoed one last time, and then Silence. Elara stopped, turning back, waiting for Jonah. But he never came. The weight of sacrifice, the cave was cold, but Elara barely felt it. She sat beside the bear, its massive body curled close for warmth, but her heart felt frozen. She clenched her fists, whispering into the dark. "You think he's okay?" The bear said nothing. But its eyes, those strange, intelligent eyes, held something she swore looked like understanding. Elara shut her own eyes tight. She didn't know if Jonah had survived. She didn't know if they would ever stop running. But she did know this: she wasn't alone. And neither was the bear. The unspoken pact. The wooden door creaked as it swung open, and the bear stumbled forward, collapsing onto the cabin floor in a heavy heap. The scent of frozen fur and iron filled the small space, the sharp, undeniable stench of blood. Elara stepped back, her hands shaking as her mind warred between terror and something deeper. The bear could have killed her instantly, but it hadn't. Instead, it lay on the wooden floor, heaving, its massive ribs rising and falling with painful effort. Snow clung to its thick fur in frozen clumps, and the deep gash along its side had begun to pool dark, sluggish blood onto the floorboards. It was dying, and yet it had come to her for help. A wound that told a story. Elara grabbed a blanket from the rocking chair and hesitated only for a moment before draping it over the bear's massive frame. It barely reacted, only flinching slightly at the touch. Her grandfather, Jonah, always told her that wild animals were unpredictable, dangerous, especially when wounded. But this bear wasn't acting like any wild animal she had ever seen. It was patient, watching her, as if it understood. Elara's eyes fell to the wound on its side, a jagged, ugly gash. Not from claws, not from a fight, from a knife. Her stomach twisted. Someone had done this to the bear, which meant whoever had attacked it might still be out there. The footsteps in the snow, a gust of wind rattled the cabin's windows. Elara moved to the curtains, her breath catching in her throat as she peered outside. At first, she saw nothing but endless white. Then, movement. A shadow flitted between the trees. Her heartbeat stuttered. Not an animal. A man. A warning in the dark. Elara spun away from the window, pressing her back against the wall. She had to wake up Jonah. She ran to his room, her fingers trembling as she shook his shoulder. "Grandpa, wake up!" Jonah grumbled, blinking sleepily before his gaze landed on her face. His tired eyes sharpened instantly. "What is it?" he asked, already sitting up. "There's a man outside," she whispered, "and I let the bear in." Jonah froze. His eyes flicked to the open door, then to the heap of fur in the living room. His face paled, but he didn't yell. He didn't scold her. Instead, he muttered a single curse under his breath before reaching for the rifle beside his bed. "Bolt the door," he said. Now, the hunter comes knocking. Minutes later, the cabin was sealed, the fire dimmed to a flicker. Jonah knelt by the bear, his old, calloused hands inspecting the wound with the kind of careful precision that only came from years of experience. Elara sat beside him, barely breathing. The bear let out a slow, low rumble, but it didn't lash out. It didn't fight. Jonah exhaled. Whoever cut this bear up knew what they were doing. This wasn't an accident. Someone tried to kill it. But they didn't finish the job. A heavy silence hung between them. Then, a knock. Elara's heart nearly stopped. Jonah didn't react right away. He only stood, rifle gripped firmly in one hand, and moved toward the door. Another knock, harder this time. "Elara," Jonah said, his voice steady. "Get to the back room. Now," Jonah said, his voice steady. "Get to the back room. Now. Now." She didn't argue. She moved quickly, crouching behind the doorway leading to the small storage room. She pressed herself against the wooden crates, heart pounding so loudly she thought it might shake the walls. Jonah opened the door just an inch. "Can I help you?" His voice was even, but there was a steel edge beneath it. A man stood on the porch, bundled in a heavy coat. His face was obscured by the low brim of his hat, but his voice carried through the cold. "Evening," the man said. "You haven't seen anything unusual tonight, have you?" Jonah didn't answer right away. "Depends on what you mean by unusual." The man shifted, placing a gloved hand on the doorframe. "I was tracking something through the storm. Big, dangerous. A bear." Jonah's grip tightened on the rifle. "No bears around here," he said evenly. The man exhaled a slow breath. "You sure about that, old man?" Jonah didn't blink. "Sure as hell am." A long pause. Then the man chuckled, stepping back from the door. "Well," he said, "if you do see anything, you let me know, won't you?" Jonah gave him nothing but silence. The man tipped his hat and disappeared into the snow. A choice that cannot be undone for a long moment. Neither of them moved. Then Jonah shut the door, locked it, and turned to Alara. "That man ain't a hunter," he said. "He's something worse." Alara's throat felt tight. "What do we do?" Jonah glanced at the bear. It was watching him, its massive body tense, waiting. "We make sure that bastard never finds what he's looking for." Alara swallowed. The unspoken words hung heavy between them. They couldn't let the bear go. They couldn't let the man come back. The burden of protection that night, Jonah and Alara worked in silence, tending to the bear's wounds. Jonah's hands were steady, but Alara could see the weight in his eyes, the silent battle raging in his mind. Protecting the bear meant inviting danger, but abandoning it meant letting something evil win. And Jonah Dawson was not a man who let evil win. As the fire crackled and the storm raged on, Alara lay beside the bear, listening to the rhythmic sound of its breath. She had never been more afraid. And yet, she had never been more certain. Tomorrow, when the sun rose, they would face whatever came next. Together, the mark of the unknown. The flickering firelight danced across the massive form of the bear, casting long shadows on the wooden walls. Alara's breath hitched. A wound she expected, but this was something else entirely. The raw, burned-in symbol on the bear's shoulder wasn't an accident. It was precise, etched deep into its skin, as if it were a brand. The edges were still raw, the flesh blistered and red despite the cold. Alara swallowed hard. This wasn't just a wild animal. Someone had marked it. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, hesitant, stopping just short of touching the scorched flesh. Behind her, Jonah stood silently, his expression dark. "That ain't just a hunting wound," he muttered. "That's a damn signature." A secret buried in flesh. Alara turned to look at him, the weight of his words sinking deep into her bones. Jonah was a man of few words, but she knew his voice when it carried fear. And right now, he was afraid. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Jonah didn't answer right away. Instead, he knelt beside the bear, tilting his head as if trying to recall something just beyond reach. Then, after a long silence, he exhaled sharply. "I've seen that symbol before." Alara's eyes widened. Jonah traced the air above the wound, not quite touching it. "Back when I was stationed in Fairbanks, before I retired, there was talk of experiments." His voice was low, barely above a whisper. Things no one wanted to admit were happening. Things done in the dark? Alara felt her stomach knot. Experiments. Jonah finally met her gaze. On animals. The room fell into silence, save for the sound of the wind howling outside. The shadows of the past. Jonah's eyes hardened as memories surfaced. Things he had buried decades ago. There was a base, he said slowly, hidden, buried in the mountains north of here. Most folks didn't even know it existed. Hell, even those of us stationed nearby weren't supposed to know. Alara's hands clenched into fists. And you think, this bear? I don't think, girl. Jonah cut in. I know. His words sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. This bear had been branded by someone, claimed, and now it was running. From what? Or who? The hunter returns a noise outside made them both stiffen. Alara turned, barely breathing, ears straining. A crunch in the snow. Someone was out there. Jonah moved first, grabbing the rifle from its place by the door. He gestured sharply for Alara to stay put, then crept toward the window, peering out into the blizzard. At first, nothing. Then, a dark figure, barely visible in the white haze, moving along the tree line. Alara's pulse thundered in her ears. He's still looking? She whispered. Jonah nodded grimly. Yeah. And I don't think he's leaving empty-handed. A dangerous decision. Alara turned back to the bear. Its deep brown eyes were locked on hers, unblinking. It knew. It knew the danger waiting outside. It had come here for protection. Alara clenched her jaw. Grandpa, she said quietly. Jonah didn't look away from the window. Yeah? If they come in here looking for it. Her voice faltered. But she forced herself to finish. We can't let them take it. Jonah finally turned to her, his gaze searching. Then slowly, he nodded. Damn right we can. Outside, the wind howled like a warning. The fight wasn't over yet. Hunted in the storm, the cabin creaked under the weight of the storm. But Alara knew the sounds outside had nothing to do with the wind. Something, or someone, was moving beyond the window. She froze, fingers still gripping the damp cloth she had been using to clean the bear's wound. The bear, injured as it was, knew too. A low, warning growl rumbled from its chest. Its massive body tensed, ears pricked, eyes fixed on the door. Jonah had already moved. Silent as a shadow, he snatched his rifle from its place by the hearth and pressed himself against the wall beside the window. He flicked off the lantern with a practiced hand, plunging the room into near darkness. Alara, he murmured, barely a whisper. Stay low. She obeyed, ducking behind the thick wooden table, pressing herself against the rough floorboards. For a few agonizing seconds all was still. Then a crunch in the snow. A slow, deliberate step. They went alone. The warning shot Jonah shifted, just enough to tilt his head and peek out the window. Alara barely dared to breathe as she watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs. Whoever was out there wasn't moving like a lost traveler. They were careful, methodical, hunting. Jonah exhaled through his nose, low and steady, then made his decision. Crack! The gunshot split the night, shattering the storm's howl. The cabin shuddered from the force of it, and outside, a yelp of surprise. Alara flinched, gripping the edge of the table. Then, running. The sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the trees. Jonah stayed still, rifle still raised, eyes on the window. For a long moment, silence. Then he turned to Alara. They're not done, he said grimly. That was just a warning. The bear's instinct. The bear was still standing, its sides heaving, its powerful muscles taut despite exhaustion. Alara felt a shiver of unease creep down her spine. This wasn't just a wounded animal. This was a survivor. A creature that had escaped something terrible, and now its pursuers were here to finish what they'd started. Jonah crouched beside the bear, close enough to see the dark smears of half-dried blood staining its thick fur. Whatever they did to you, he muttered. They want you back. The bear rumbled deep in its chest, a sound that was more than just instinct. It was understanding. Alara swallowed hard. Then we don't let them take it. Jonah studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. All right, kid, he said, rising to his feet. Then we get ready. Trapping the hunters, they moved quickly. Jonah bolted the door, checking every lock, every window. The cabin was sturdy, but it wasn't built to withstand a siege. They're human, he said, voice low. That means they need shelter too. The storm's on our side. For now, Ilara's mind raced, so they'll wait it out. Try again in the morning. Jonah exhaled. If they're smart. Ilara turned to the bear. It was watching them, ears flicking toward every sound outside. It wasn't just reacting, it was listening. She took a deep breath. What if we don't wait? Jonah raised an eyebrow. She set her jaw. They think we're prey. What if we show them they're wrong? For the first time that night, Jonah grinned. That's my girl. A plan of fire and ice, the old trapper's tricks still worked, even in a modern world. Jonah had spent decades in the wild, learning how to outthink predators, human and animal alike. They worked in silence. Jonah rigged the perimeter with tripwires, old hunting snares that would tangle an unwary foot. Ilara gathered kerosene and cloth, crafting makeshift torches they could use if it came to a fight. And the bear waited. The second attack, the first sign, came just before dawn. A snap. Sharp and sudden. One of the snares had caught something. Jonah was at the window in an instant, rifle at the ready. Ilara's stomach churned as she peered over his shoulder. In the pale light of early morning, a man struggled against the trap. Dressed in heavy black gear, his face was masked, his movements precise. Not a lost traveler, a soldier. Jonah didn't hesitate. He threw open the door, rifle aimed. Stay where you are, he barked. And I won't put another hole in you. The man froze. But his eyes, sharp, calculating, weren't afraid. Ilara, Jonah said without looking back. Go inside. Now. She didn't argue. She felt it too. There were more. And they were closing, The bear's fury before Jonah could fire. The trees exploded with movement. Dark shapes, moving fast. 4 of them. Jonah swung his rifle, but too late. One lunged forward, a knife flashing. Ilara screamed, and the bear moved. With impossible speed, the massive beast barreled forward. A wall of muscle and fury. The nearest attacker barely had time to react before a paw, the size of a man's chest, struck him full force. Bone cracked. The man collapsed, limp. The others stumbled back, weapons raised, but the bear was already on them. It wasn't just fighting. It was defending, protecting Ilara. The final shot, Jonah didn't waste time. While the bear tore through its captors, he took aim. Crack! One man fell. The second turned to run, too late. Jonah's second shot took him down. Ilara was on her knees, hands over her mouth, watching it all happen in seconds that stretched like eternity. Then, silence. The storm had settled. The hunters lay still, and the bear, breathing hard, bloodied but victorious, stood in the snow, staring at them. Ilara met its gaze. Not just an animal. Something more. A debt repaid. Jonah exhaled, lowering his gun. That's one way to handle it. Ilara let out a shaky laugh, still staring at the bear. It blinked slowly. Then with one final look it turned, and walked back into the wild. Ilara's chest ached as she watched it go. But she understood. They had saved it. And tonight, it had saved them. Into the blizzard's maw, the cold bit deep, slicing through layers of clothing and burning against exposed skin. Snow whipped through the air in violent gusts, swirling around Alara, Jonah, and the massive bear that trotted beside them, its wounded shoulder darkened by frozen blood. The tracks outside their cabin had made one thing clear. They were being hunted. Jonah had spent his entire life in the Alaskan wilderness. He knew when to stand and fight, and when to run. This time, they ran. The silent pursuers, the forest loomed ahead, a tangled labyrinth of skeletal trees bending under the weight of ice and snow. Jonah led the way, his rifle slung over his shoulder, his breath misting in thick clouds. Alara followed close behind, gripping the bear's thick fur for balance as they moved through the deep drifts. The bear didn't resist. It knew. Behind them, the storm howled, but Alara could hear something else. Faint, deliberate movements in the distance. She glanced over her shoulder. Shadows flickered through the trees. They were not alone. Jonah swore under his breath. "They're closing in!" The bear growled low and deep, a warning that carried through the storm. Jonah nodded grimly. "Good. Let's lead them where we want." The ice chasm. Jonah adjusted course, steering them toward a section of the forest. Alara had never dared enter alone. The ground here was treacherous. Hidden crevices, ice-covered ravines, and patches of thinly frozen lakes. The perfect place to turn the hunters into the hunted. Jonah gestured toward a cluster of boulders half buried in snow. "Alara, get behind those rocks and stay low. If something happens to me." "No." Alara snapped before he could finish. "We're in this together." Jonah gave her a sharp look but didn't argue. The bear huffed, stepping forward to stand between them and the approaching figures. It had no intention of hiding. Alara pressed her back against the icy stone, heart pounding. She heard it then. The first shot. Gunfire in the snow, the crack of a rifle echoed through the storm. The bullet whizzed past, kicking up snow just inches from Jonah's foot. They were here. Jonah fired back without hesitation. A scream. Someone hit. The bear lunged forward, powerful despite its injuries. It knew this was a fight for survival. From the trees, more figures emerged, ghost-like in the swirling white. Jonah cursed. "They've got numbers." Alara's pulse hammered. But she wasn't helpless. Alara's choice, she remembered the traps. The ones her grandfather had set long ago for hunting wolves and mountain lions. If they worked on those predators, why not now? Gripping the knife at her belt, she darted through the snow, keeping low. Jonah saw her move. "Alara, I've got a plan," she shouted back. The first attacker lunged toward her, and Alara ducked, rolling through the snow just as he stepped onto the frozen ground beneath him. Crack! The ice gave way. The man let out a strangled scream as he plunged into the freezing water below. Another attacker turned toward her, only to be slammed off his feet by the bear. Alara scrambled back, gasping for breath. Jonah fired another shot, and another figure fell. But more kept coming. Too many! The final gambit. Jonah grabbed Alara's arm. "We can't win like this. We need to go now." The bear turned, blood staining the snow beneath its paws. It was tired, it was hurt, and yet it still stood its ground. Jonah's jaw clenched. He reached into his pack, pulling out something small and metal. "A flare, Alara," he said. "You're about to see an avalanche up close." He struck the flare and hurled it into the mountainside above. The explosion wasn't loud, but it was enough to wake the snow. For a second, nothing happened. Then, a deep, resonant rumble. Alara's breath caught. Then the mountain moved. Buried in white, the avalanche roared down, swallowing everything in its path. The pursuers had no time to react. Snow and ice crashed over them, burying them in an instant. Jonah grabbed Alara and pulled her backward. The bear moved on instinct, shielding them with its massive body. The air was thick with white, the world lost in a deafening silence. Then, stillness. Survivors, Jonah exhaled slowly, lowering his rifle. The enemy was gone. Buried. Ilara's hands trembled. "Did we just—" "We survived," Jonah said simply. She turned to the bear. It was watching her, its deep eyes holding something almost human. Gratitude, understanding. Jonah nodded toward the horizon. "Come on, kid. Time to go." The bear huffed, then turned, and walked with them into the storm. Together, no longer prey, but something more. The last stand at Shadow Ridge, the wind screamed through the jagged cliffs, carrying with it the scent of frost, blood, and something far more primal. Fear. Jonah Dawson had faced fear before. During his years in the military, he had seen men break under it, had felt it creeping through his own bones in the dead of night. But this was different. This was the kind of fear that didn't leave room for second chances. His back pressed against the cold, unforgiving rock wall. He gripped his hunting knife tightly. The rifle was long gone, lost in the frantic chase. Ilara stood beside him, her small hands clenched into fists, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The bear, their bear, stood in front of them, muscles coiled, its massive form blocking the only way forward. And in the snow beyond them, the mercenaries closed in. There were 6 of them now, the ones who had survived the bear's earlier onslaught, regrouping, flanking, pushing them toward this dead end. The leader, the one Jonah had shot at before, stood at the front, his visor reflecting the pale light of the moon. Jonah knew how this would go. Cornered prey didn't survive long. But then the bear moved. The awakening, the low growl that rumbled from its throat wasn't just a warning. It was something more. Jonah had seen battle-hardened men enter a different state of mind before a fight. When instinct took over, when the thinking part of the brain shut down and something older, something carved into the marrow of survival, took control. That was what happened to the bear. Its breath came in thick, powerful huffs. Its shoulders squared. And when the first shot rang out, it didn't flinch. The bullet grazed its shoulder, but instead of recoiling, instead of fleeing, it charged. The battle in the blizzard, the mercenaries barely had time to react. The bear tore through the snow, a force of muscle and fury, slamming into the first attacker with the weight of a wrecking ball. The man let out a strangled cry as he was lifted off his feet and thrown backward, crashing against a boulder with a sickening crunch. Jonah saw his chance. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the moonlight, catching the second soldier just beneath the ribs. The man grunted, staggering, but Jonah twisted the blade, driving it deeper before pulling back. One down. Ilara had dropped to the ground, scrambling for cover behind the rocks. The next few seconds were pure chaos. Gunfire cracked through the storm, but the bear was relentless. It moved with purpose, with precision. It wasn't just an animal attacking blindly. It knew how to fight. One soldier raised his rifle, too slow. The bear swiped, claws slicing through the Kevlar like it was paper. Another mercenary tried to retreat, turning on his heel, but the bear was faster. It lunged, its powerful jaws clamping down on the man's shoulder, shaking him violently before throwing him aside. Jonah had no time to marvel at the sheer brutality, because there was still one left, the leader, the one who had spoken before. Jonah turned just in time to see the man level his weapon, not at the bear, at Ilara. The unthinkable choice. Jonah didn't think. He moved. He threw himself forward, tackling the mercenary to the ground. They hit the snow hard, rolling, struggling. The man was bigger, stronger. But Jonah had rage on his side. He slammed his fist into the soldier's visor, cracking. The man snarled, throwing Jonah off with a powerful shove. Jonah hit the ground, wind knocked from his lungs. He rolled, expecting the killing blow, but it never came, because Ilara had picked up a stone the size of her fist and smashed it into the back of the soldier's head. The man staggered, just long enough. The bear finished it. A single swipe, The mercenary fell, and then silence. The aftermath, the only sound was the howling wind. The bodies lay scattered in the snow, their weapons useless beside them. Jonah forced himself up, his entire body screaming in protest. He turned to Alara, his granddaughter, his fighter. She was shaking, her small hands red from gripping the stone, but she was alive. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "You did good, kid," he whispered. And then he looked at the bear. It was still standing, its sides heaving, blood dripping from fresh wounds. Jonah met its gaze. He had never believed in things like fate. But this moment, it felt like something more. Like this bear had been meant to find them. Like it had been waiting for them. Like it had known they were the only ones who could help it. Jonah didn't know what came next. The storm was still raging. The danger wasn't over. But they had survived. And for now, that was enough. The price of survival, the low hum of the military helicopter, vibrated through the storm-heavy air, cutting through the eerie silence left in the wake of the battle. Snow flurried around the downwash of the rotor blades, casting ghostly spirals in the pale moonlight. Jonah Dawson shielded Alara as the aircraft descended, his grip tightening around her small frame. The bear, Odin, stood tall beside them, his thick coat matted with blood, breath rising in heavy clouds. His massive form remained still, eyes locked on the approaching soldiers, as if he knew exactly who they were. Jonah had fought in wars, had witnessed the arrival of reinforcements in the midst of hopeless battles, but this different. Because this time, he wasn't sure if the soldiers were friend or foe. The arrival of Captain Hale, the helicopter door slid open with a metallic hiss, and a tall figure stepped out, his uniform dark against the blinding white of the snow. Captain Marcus Hale. Jonah recognized the stance, the way the man carried himself. Not just a soldier, but a leader. His sharp eyes surveyed the battlefield in a practiced sweep, noting the fallen mercenaries, the battered survivors, and finally, the bear. For a moment, no one moved. Then Hale raised a hand, signaling his team to hold position. "I knew you'd find your way back, Odin," he said, his voice barely audible over the fading whir of the road. Odin huffed, his body sagging slightly, exhaustion catching up to him, now that the fight was over. Jonah took a cautious step forward, placing himself between Alara and the approaching soldiers. "You know this bear." His voice was firm, wary. Hale's gaze flickered to him, "More than you can imagine." Alara clung to Jonah's coat, her voice trembling but determined. "He saved us. He's not dangerous." Hale exhaled sharply. "That's not what the people hunting him believe." The truth about Odin Jonah kept his stance firm. "Then why don't you tell us the truth?" Hale hesitated only for a moment before speaking. "Odin isn't just a bear. He was part of Project Revenant, a classified military experiment meant to enhance animal intelligence and combat effectiveness." Jonah stiffened. He had heard whispers of such programs during his years of service, attempts to weaponize nature itself. Alara's fingers dug into his sleeve. They hurt him, didn't they? Hale's jaw tightened. They made him something he was never meant to be. Jonah's gaze dropped to Odin. The old wounds, the burned-in markings. It all made sense now. Hale continued. But Odin never turned into the weapon they wanted. Instead of following orders, he did something none of the scientists predicted. Alara's eyes shone with unshed tears. He protected people. Hale nodded. The first time he defied command was during an engagement overseas. His handler was killed in an ambush, and instead of attacking the enemy, Odin shielded wounded soldiers, allowing them to escape. After that, he was marked as uncontrollable. They tried to recondition him, tried to break him. Jonah felt a surge of anger. He had seen men broken by the military before, but an animal? Alara's voice was barely above a whisper, but he escaped. Hale gave a grim smile. Not just once. Every time they tried to contain him, he found a way out. And now here. Jonah glanced back at Odin. The bear's eyes met his, filled with something Jonah could only describe as understanding. "He's not an experiment," Jonah said. "He's one of us." A difficult choice. The sound of approaching snowmobiles in the distance snapped them all to attention. More mercenaries. Hale's men lifted their rifles. But Jonah knew the truth. They didn't have time for another fight. "We need to leave. Now," Hale ordered. Jonah hesitated. "Where are you taking him?" Hale's expression was unreadable. "Someplace safe." Jonah wasn't convinced. Safe for who? The military? Or Odin? Alara's grip on his coat tight. "We can't let them take him, Grandpa. He belongs with us," Odin rumbled lowly, stepping closer to them, his presence an undeniable force. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about trust. Hale exhaled, weighing his options. "I can't promise you anything, but I'll fight for him." Jonah studied the man. There was sincerity in his eyes, but also the burden of command. The weight of knowing that some battles couldn't be won. More headlights appeared in the storm. Time was up. Jonah made his decision. "We go together." The escape the next few minutes were a blur of movement. Hale's soldiers formed a protective perimeter as Jonah, Alara, and Odin boarded the helicopter. The rotors screamed to life, snow whipping violently as the aircraft lifted off, just as the first bullets tore through the night. Alara gasped, gripping Jonah's arm. The mercenaries had reached the clearing, their weapons flashing in the darkness. But they were too late. The helicopter soared higher, leaving the chaos behind. Jonah glanced at Odin. The bear lay stretched out on the floor, his massive body finally at rest. Alara leaned against Jonah, exhaustion overtaking her. "We safe now," she murmured. Jonah wasn't sure, because he knew the truth. They weren't running toward safety. They were running toward war. And Odin, the bear who had refused to be a weapon, was at the center of it all. The legacy of Odin, the roar of the helicopter's blades faded into the distance, swallowed by the vast expanse of the Alaskan wilderness. Snow fell in thick, silent sheets, erasing footprints almost as quickly as they had been made. Alara stood motionless, her small hands still tingling with the warmth of Odin's thick fur. He was gone. Jonah placed a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder, his grip steady despite the storm that swirled around them. "Some things," he murmured, "aren't meant to be caged." Alara swallowed hard, blinking against the cold. "He knew," she whispered. "He knew if he went with them, he'd never be free again." Marcus Hale exhaled, his breath forming a cloud in the frozen air. His military instincts told him to pursue, to track Odin and bring him back under control. But something in the way the Great Bear had looked at him, looked through him, stopped him. Odin had made his choice. And deep down, Hale knew there was no force on Earth that could capture him now. Aftermath and consequences, the days that followed were a blur of movement. The authorities swept in, securing what remained of the mercenary group that had been hunting Odin. The revelation of Project Revenant sent shockwaves through the military and intelligence communities, igniting ethical debates and classified inquiries. Jonah and Alara were taken to a secure military installation for debriefing. Alara hated every moment of it. The endless questions, the white walls, the coldness of it all. Jonah, however, knew how these things worked. He had been a soldier once. He understood that there were no simple endings. Not in wars, not in government experiments, and certainly not in situations like this. One evening as Alara sat alone in the sterile military facility, Staring at the snowfall outside, Hale approached her. He was different now, less rigid, less sure. "You miss him?" he said. Alara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Hale hesitated, then sat beside her. Odin was more than an experiment, he admitted, more than a weapon. He was proof that something we thought we controlled was stronger than us all. Alara turned to face him, her eyes burning. "You mean you finally understand that he's not something? He's someone?" Hale didn't argue, because she was right. Whispers in the wind. Weeks passed. Jonah and Alara were eventually allowed to return to their cabin, but nothing felt the same. The woods were quieter somehow, as if mourning the absence of the guardian that had once roamed them. Jonah resumed his daily routines, chopping wood, tending the land, but he moved slower than before, more thoughtful. Alara, however, couldn't let go. Every night, she would sit by the window waiting, listening, hoping. One evening, as a fresh snowfall blanketed the world outside, she heard something. A sound so faint, so distant, that she almost thought she imagined it. A deep, resonant growl. She rushed to the door, flinging it open against the icy wind. There, just beyond the tree line, a massive shadow stood, barely visible against the backdrop of the snow-covered pines. Odin. He didn't move forward. He didn't come closer, but he was watching, acknowledging, a silent promise passing between them. Then, as swiftly as he had come, he turned and disappeared into the darkness of the wild. Alara didn't cry. She didn't call after him, because this time she understood. Some bonds don't need words. Some goodbyes aren't really goodbyes. Odin wasn't lost. He was exactly where he was meant to be. A story to remember years later, when the snowstorms came and the world outside turned silent once more. Travelers passing through those lands would speak in hushed voices of a legend, of a bear too intelligent, too strong, too wise to be just an ordinary beast. Of a creature that once stood between man and destruction, not as a weapon but as a protector. And deep in the heart of the forest, where few dared to go, the whispers remained. That somewhere, beyond the reach of men, Odin still roamed free. The lesson of Odin, freedom, choice, and the power of compassion. The story of Odin is more than just an extraordinary tale of survival. It is a reflection of the world we live in today. At its core, it speaks to the struggle between control and freedom, between fear and trust, and ultimately the courage it takes to do what is right, even when the odds are stacked against us. In a world that often seeks to contain, categorize, and control, Odin's story reminds us that not everything can, or should, be tamed. We see it in the way people are expected to conform to societal norms, in the way systems dictate what is deemed acceptable, and in the way fear often governs our decision. Just like the scientists behind Project Revenant sought to use Odin for their own purposes, we too sometimes find ourselves trapped in expectations that strip away our individuality, our choices, and at times, even our humanity. But Odin chose differently, and that choice is what makes his story so powerful. He was created for a purpose dictated by others, but when given the opportunity, he reclaimed his own purpose. He refused to be just a tool, just an experiment. Instead, he made a decision to protect those who showed him kindness and, in the end, walked away from the world that tried to own him. This applies to us in ways we might not always recognize. How many times do we allow ourselves to be defined by what others expect? How often do we suppress our true desires because they don't align with what society deems appropriate? Odin's choice, to walk into the storm, to embrace the unknown, teaches us that true strength lies in the willingness to forge our own path. Yet, there is another lesson in Odin's story, one of compassion and trust. Alara, just a child, had no reason to believe that a wounded, massive grizzly bear would not harm her. Every survival instinct told her to stay inside, to shut the door, to protect herself. But she listened to something deeper, empathy. She saw past the fear, past the instinct, and chose to help. How often do we judge others by their appearances, their pasts, or the stories we've been told about them? How many opportunities for connection do we miss because we choose fear over understanding? Alara's simple act of trust, offering warmth and aid to a creature others would have feared, changed the course of not just her life, but Odin's as well. In our world, where divisions are so often emphasized, where people are judged before they are understood, Odin's story reminds us that acts of compassion can break cycles of fear. Sometimes, the greatest courage is not in fighting battles, but in extending a hand, whether to a stranger, to an outcast, or to a creature in need. Odin's legacy is not just one of survival, but of freedom, trust, and the power of choosing kindness in a world that so often forgets its worth. Thank you for joining us on this journey. If this story moved you, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more inspiring stories of resilience, hope, and the unbreakable spirit of life. See you in the next story.